All right, welcome everyone to our ORCID workshop for researchers. I'll start with a couple of introductions. So my name is Kayla Ramhit. I am the program specialist for the ORCID US community, and my colleague Paolo Guhilde is with us today as well. He's the senior strategist for the ORCID US community, and we will both be presenting today. So we'd like to start today's session with a really quick question for you all. Feel free to share your answers in the chat. And this question is, what are some of the challenges or barriers that you are encountering with ORCID? And this can be for anyone who's already started using ORCID or has encountered ORCID for the first time, or maybe you haven't started using ORCID and you're facing some challenges getting started. So feel free to share your answers in the chat and we can discuss at the end of the presentation. But I will go ahead to our agenda for today. So we'll start by talking about what is ORCID, and we'll go into the benefits of ORCID for researchers. Then we'll talk about how to populate your ORCID record and each different section of the ORCID record in a little more detail. And we'll talk about the best ways to get the most use out of your ORCID record. And then at the end, we'll have some time for a Q&A. So let's start with a very brief introduction to ORCID. So what is ORCID? ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. ORCID is an identifier that is meant to uniquely identify you as a researcher so that you can get credit and attribution for your work. And it can streamline your digital identity so you can save time on administrative tasks like filling out forms. It can help you to keep track of your affiliations and contributions all in one place. Um, One of the main components of ORCID is the ORCID ID, which is the unique persistent identifier that is free of charge to researchers and individuals. So an ORCID ID is a 16-digit number that is unique to you as the individual. It distinguishes researchers from each other and is free for anyone to use. So we have an example here, Paolo's ORCID ID. You'll notice it looks like a link, and that's because it is. So this ORCID ID links to his ORCID record. So if we click on that link, we're taken to Paolo's ORCID record, which is populated with information similar to what you might see on like a CV or a resume. So the ORCID record includes information about the individual from their employment history, education, works, and many other things. So I'll briefly mention what can be found within an ORCID record now, and Paolo will go into more detail later in our presentation. So using our volunteer researcher Sophia's ORCID record as an example, you'll see that her ORCID record contains a section for different name formations, a biography, her country, and a section for keywords describing her research areas, and importantly, a section on her employment history. So if we scroll down through her ORCID record, we begin to see the other sections, her education and qualifications. Professional activities such as membership, service, distinction, and invited positions, what funding she's received, uh, her research equipment that she's used, her works, which include publications she's written, and then at the very end, her peer review activity. So also something we want to share with you all, which is new this year, ORCID has introduced some new work types to better support a wider range of arts and humanities research outputs. So here are just a few examples of those. Musical compositions, artistic outputs and images, lectures, blogs, interviews, conference presentations, and many other work types. So I've introduced you to the ORCID ID and the ORCID record, but let's take a step back a little bit and let me tell you about ORCID from a more global perspective and what it can do on a larger scale. So you as a researcher may work as, let's say, a professor or a faculty member at a university, which means you work closely with your employer, tracking your achievements and your research. And then when you do your research, you may apply for grants along the way, which means you'll work with a funder to apply for those grant awards. And then when you're ready to publish that research in a paper or a journal, you'll work with a publisher to publish it. At each stage of this process, you can use your ORCID ID and ORCID record to streamline how you're filling out forms to get grants from a funder, for example, or sharing your information with the publisher, or how you report your work to your university. It makes this process at each level of the research lifecycle more efficient and saves you time. And we'll talk more about this in a second when we get to the benefits of ORCID. But of course, how can you get an ORCID ID? This process is very quick and easy. It takes less than 60 seconds to register for your own ORCID ID. We'll post a link in the chat for you so you can register if you haven't already or if you would like to. So I've talked about what ORCID is, what the ORCID ID and the ORCID record is. Let's go into some benefits. So ORCID can distinguish researchers from each other. An ORCID ID persists over time, even if a researcher's name or anything in their life changes. It can bolster a researcher's digital identity, ensure that researchers meet funder, publisher, and reporting requirements, and it can also help save time when filling out forms and reducing your administrative burden. So let's talk about each of those things. So an ORCID ID can distinguish researchers from each other. In this example of a PubMed abstract, you'll notice here that there's a lot of authors and similar names. It's hard to tell who's who without any additional information to distinguish them from one another. So an ORCID ID ensures that a researcher's research outputs and activities are correctly attributed to them. An ORCID ID stays the same and can tie a researcher to their affiliations and activities throughout their career, even if their name changes or they share a name with someone else. So you'll see here our volunteer researcher, Sophia. She uses many names when she publishes. Sometimes she uses Sophia Garcia, S. Hernandez Garcia, or S.M. Garcia. And it's not always clear that these different names are of how she uses her name are all the same person. But with an ORCID record, you can include all your different name formations in the ORCID record. And when you publish, you can share your ORCID ID with the publisher. And that's important because an ORCID ID is persistent and unique to you, the researcher, throughout your entire career. So if your name changes, you're able to ensure that all your work is correctly attributed to you. So an ORCID record can also bolster a researcher's digital identity. So when you share your ORCID ID with an employer for reporting purposes, for example, that organization can see what funding you've received or what work you've published all in one place very easily. So for example, this abstract has several authors and several of them have ORCID ID icons that link directly to their ORCID records. So if we click on one, we can see all the work they've done, such as in this example here, this work was pushed from Crossref to their ORCID record, validating that this researcher published this work. Another example is this peer review activity. This validates that researcher's peer review experience. So ORCID can also help with meeting requirements for funders. There are many funders that are requiring or encouraging the use of ORCID when applying for grants or for funding. You can see a list of some of those funders here: American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and many others. And they want you to have an ORCID ID so they can verify your identity and also so they can see from your ORCID record what previous work you've already done. And this is also true for federal funders. They're starting to require or encourage ORCID when applying for funding. In the past few years, a presidential memorandum, the National Security Presidential Memo 33, or NSPM 33, stated that federal agencies shall establish policies regarding requirements for researchers applying for funding to provide a digital persistent identifier. So they want investigators or researchers to have an identifier when applying for ORCID. Sorry, when applying for funding. And ORCID is such an identifier. So we, the ORCID US community, have created a document summarizing the US federal funder policies related to ORCID. This is a living document, so we're updating it as these new policies come out. So take a look at this document and work with your research administrators to stay informed on these federal funder policies. And Paolo will link to in the chat for you. So an ORCID ID can also streamline the collection of data for certain workflows. So this is especially important for federal funders, as you can see in this example, when you're creating your biosketch in Science CV. You can use ORCID to populate your biosketch quickly. So Science CV connects with ORCID, allowing you to pull the data from your ORCID record and upload it into your biosketch. So if you go into Science CV, you can choose ORCID as an external source and specify what information from your ORCID record you want to add to your biosketch. And this just makes that process easier and more efficient. So ORCID can also help with meeting requirements for funders. When you submit your manuscript to a publication, often your publisher will ask or require you to include your ORCID ID. So here's a list of some of those publishers: the American Chemical Society, IEEE, Springer Nature, Science Open, Wiley, as well as many more. Publishers are asking for ORCID IDs so they can include the ID in the DOI metadata. And this is important for making sure you as a researcher are getting credit for your work. And some publishers can potentially push your publications to your ORCID record for you. So here's an example from Springer Nature. They're asking that all corresponding authors include and link their ORCID ID and record when publishing their manuscripts. So as you can see here, because you as a researcher have shared your ORCID ID with the publisher, it is included in that DOI metadata. So now, in this example, Crossref was able to add this article to this researcher's ORCID record and link the researcher to that publication. This green check mark here shows that Crossref is a trusted source, adding validity and credibility to what you have in your ORCID record. So anyone who sees this article listed in your ORCID record can trust that you are the author or the co-author of this work. And this is also true when you are a peer reviewer for a journal. Some journals are able to push peer review activity to ORCID records, and as you can see here from Web of Science at the bottom. So we've talked about funders, publishers. Let's talk about research organizations and how they're using ORCID. So some organizations, usually like a university, so Binghamton, Cornell, Florida State, Stanford, are asking their researchers, their students, and their faculty to have an ORCID ID. And a lot of this has to do with how they're tracking or reporting the research that their faculty or researchers are doing. So organizations do this so they can streamline how you as a researcher can share your work with their university, such as in faculty reporting or during an annual review process. So you'll see in this example from Florida State University, they're able to grab the publications or works from their researchers' ORCID records and use them in their reporting system. In addition, some universities are also pulling publications from their researchers' ORCID records so they can add it to their faculty profiles, like in the bottom here in this example from Oklahoma State University. And so what this all comes down to is really saving you time as a researcher. If you populate your ORCID record with information on your career, your employment, education, works, funding, you can more easily share that information in forms from reporting more efficiently and easily, freeing up your time to continue to do the research you want to do and what you need to do. The research ecosystem depicted here is interconnected, and the researcher is at the center of that ecosystem. You connect to each aspect of the life cycle. Funding agencies can push funding awards and grants to your ORCID record. Publishers push works or publications. Universities can push education or employment. And it's all designed to support your research and to more easily navigate this process. And the best way to do that is to learn how you can populate your ORCID record. And so with that, I will let Paolo take over.
Thank you, Kayla, and thank you for showing us the benefits of ORCID. So right now we're going to talk about how we can populate your ORCID record or a researcher's ORCID record. This is really a way to kind of make it easier for everyone to populate it and ways that or tips that could be valuable in terms of like making it easier for everyone to do so and maintain it in the future. So we'll go through a little bit of ways that we can do that from here. And then, of course, feel free to ask any questions you may have throughout. All right. So the way that we could add information, so they're different in your ORCID record. So these are some of basically the different sections that are available in your ORCID record. So we have that biographical information, employment, education and qualifications. These are the ones that Kayla kind of walked through a little bit earlier. And there was a question that came in as well about peer review. Um, so the peer review section only really appears if an organization push that information into somebody's ORCID record. So the peer review section as well as the research resources are the two sections that will not show up if you don't have those activities being pushed by an organization. But we can show you how that will appear at some point in down during this portion of the presentation as well. All right, so on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the different ways that you could add information to ORCID. And these are really a way to where it could be a manual entry. The other one is a search and link wizard that's available in ORCID and that's available in the works and the funding section. And the third one is automatically via trusted organizations. And this is basically kind of like that question about when does the peer review activity shows up in your ORCID record. All right, so we'll go through the manual entry first on the next slide. So the manual entry of employment, and an example here is through an employment section. So this is a manual entry. This would be like, when you go to your ORCID record and then you would say, oh, I want to add an employment record or where I worked at. So you would click on employment by clicking on that add button that has a plus sign, and then there will be a drop down, a pop-up, and then you will start entering the organization that you worked at. So an example here where I used to work is at Northwestern University. So I just started typing in Northwestern here, and then there will be an option or sort of like a drop down menu for your pre-populated options that you can choose from. So with this, we always recommend that you pick one of those organizations that appear, especially if that's, of course, if that's the one that you worked at. So in this case, Northwestern University. So I would click on Northwestern University, and then I would basically fill out that form that's available here with all the information that it's looking for, the different fields. So that could be the department, the role, the title, the dates, all of those information. We always recommend that you fill that out. So when you do that, on the next slide, we will see how this appears in your ORCID record. So in the employment section of your ORCID. So once you fill out that kind of employment form and that affiliation form, this will show up in your ORCID record as such. So you have the information, the dates, the roles. You will also have information about when it was added. And one thing I want to point out here is that source where that kind of red arrow is at. So the source of the data is my name, and that's because it's manually entered. So since I entered it myself, I am the source of the data. So that's kind of one of the things that you want to take a look at. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different sources down the line in this presentation. On the next slide, we are going to show you basically the different areas where you can enter manually in ORCID. So you have the education, qualifications, invited positions, distinctions, memberships, and service. You can also manually enter on the biography, also known as, so those are like the different names that you have used, country, keywords, and websites and social links, of course. So these are the areas where you can manually enter information at. On the next slide, we are going to go through a little bit on the search and link wizard. So this is another way where you could add information to your ORCID record. The search and link wizard is basically kind of built-in, I would call it almost like databases within ORCID when you're filling out the forms or when you're populating your ORCID record. So here you would click on add and then click on search and link wizard. So this is probably one of the best way to add works or publications in your ORCID record, for example, is to do a search and link wizard. So you would click on search and link wizard, and on the next slide, there will be a pop-up in your ORCID record. So when you click on Search and Link Wizard, there will be a pop-up, and these are the different kind of built-in databases that's available in ORCID that you could make connections to. So you would be able to see, like, for example, Crossref metadata search, data site for data sets that you have. You could also click on EuroPubMed Central if you like. EuroPubMed is basically have similar content as PubMed in the US. So if you want to make a connection or grabbing publications from PubMed, you can just click on EuroPubMed Central and you should be able to do that. Now, in this process for adding works to your ORCID record, we're gonna show you on how you can do this via Crossref metadata search. So when you click on Crossref metadata search and these options, on the next slide, um, you will get basically the authorization page. So when you click on that Crossref metadata search, it will then take you to this ORCID authorization page. The authorization page is really for you as a researcher, as an ORCID user, to give permission to Crossref, for example. to make updates or changes to your ORCID record. Basically, for you that you're giving them permission that they can add this publication, for example, to your ORCID record. Now, we want to really point this out because you, as a researcher, as an ORCID user, you have full control of your ORCID record. So you make that authorization that this organization or this system is able to make that changes to your ORCID record. So you click on authorize access, and then on the next slide, it should take you to the ORCID or the Crossref database. So the Crossref metadata search. So within here, you will see on that left page or left side where you'll see my name. You can search for your name, the ORCID ID, for example, the title or DOI of the publications that you have. Now, one of the easiest way to do this is to just search for the name, for your name as a researcher, for example. So here an example is I search for my name, and then the different publications shows up. And then I would search basically essentially claiming the publication that I've already published here. So I would search for the publications that I have. And there's an example down here that says books on demand. So that's one of my publications. And then I went ahead and I want to add that to my ORCID record. So when I click on that, there should be like an icon that says add to ORCID. And then I would say, yes, I want this added to my ORCID record. And once it's added on this same database, it will say that it's already in your ORCID record. And then on the next slide, we will see how this looks like in ORCID. So in ORCID, you will see this. So this is after I claim that publication and add it to my ORCID record, it will show like this in my ORCID record. So you have the publications, the title, of course, the metadata that's associated with it. And again, you have that source. Again, the source here is my name via Crossref metadata search. So Crossref metadata search is sort of like that database in ORCID, and then my name, since I added this myself. All right. So on the next slide, the search and link wizard is also available in the funding section of ORCID. So really you have two sections where search and link wizard is available. One is in the work section and the other is in the funding section. It works similarly, pretty much. So when you add funding, for example, or your researchers wants to add funding, one thing that they could do is they could do a search and link wizard in funding section. So they would click on that search and link wizard, and then on the next slide, it will give them there's only one option for a funding search and link wizard in ORCID, and that's Dimensions Wizard. So they will be presented with this. So as a researcher, or if you want to add funding in your ORCID record, you can go ahead and click on that Dimensions Wizard, and it will take you to that Dimensions Wizard database. And again, you can do the searches with your name and all of those things. And then you can go ahead and add that to your ORCID record. All right, on the next slide, the third way that you could add information or add works to your ORCID record, for example, is through an automatic update or basically an automatic update via trusted organizations. Now, this is when organizations push that information to your ORCID record themselves. So basically, it's not a manual entry, it's not through a search and link wizard, but rather say your employer push the employment information to your ORCID record automatically to your ORCID. Or it could be like, say, for example, the funder that you have received an award from push the funding information to your ORCID record. Now, when you do a trusted organization, you essentially will be giving permission to the organizations that they can make changes to your ORCID record or update your ORCID record. So again, you will be presented when you make that connection with an organization, you will be presented with an authorization page, as you see here on the left image. So you have that authorization page, you would give them authorization, that organization. And then once you have provided that authorization or access to your ORCID record, All of these organizations will then appear, or systems will then appear in the trusted parties of your ORCID record. So you'll see that on the right side here. So these are basically the trusted organizations that have given permissions to make changes to my ORCID record. So you'll see that different kind of organizations as well as systems that are able to push information to my ORCID record or grab information from my ORCID record. Now, on the next slide, it's really important to kind of know that a trusted organization, when they are pushing this information to your ORCID record, they become the source of the data. So an example here, that first one that says Binghamton University, that's an employment information. The next one from American Heart Association is a funding information. And the third one from Vibly is publications or a works um, information that's being added to ORCID. So, as a researcher, when you give that permission, those organizations become a trusted organization in your ORCID record. And when trusted organizations push information to your ORCID record, they become the source of that data. So you will see that source right there with a green check mark. The green check mark here on the next slide is really an indicator that it is a trust marker. So essentially, that this trust marker with that green kind of check mark, it tells you that there's credibility and validity to your ORCID record because it is validated by the organization. They are the one that pushed that information to your ORCID record. So it provides a little bit more of credibility and validity to the entry itself. So, it's really kind of saying like, yes, this person works at this organization. So that's really a big part of that. So that's the trust marker. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the visibility settings. So I have mentioned earlier that you as a researcher or the ORCID user has full control of their ORCID record, and that includes the visibility settings of your ORCID record. So there are ways that you can set the visibility settings of your ORCID record. You can do a full control of the entire ORCID record itself, or you can do it individually. So for example, I just want this part of my employment. So if I say Northwestern University and I want to control the visibility of that portion, I can do that. And these are the ways where you can control that visibility. There are three ways that you can do that. Everyone basically means that it's publicly available. So it's available to pretty much anyone that can go in, that can see your ORCID record. The next one is a trusted organizations only. So meaning those organizations that if you have given permissions to can access the data from your ORCID record. So if I've only given permission to Northwestern University, for example, for my ORCID record, they're the only ones that could um, access that data from my ORCID record. But this is going to be for every trusted organizations that you have given permissions to or authorizations. They will have access to that ORCID record. And the third option is what we're calling only me. And this means it's publicly available. I know, sorry. That's the opposite. I know. Only me means private only. So that means it's only available to you as a researcher. It doesn't make sense as much since, no one is able to see this information. So um, it's always recommended to do the trusted organization or publicly available. But there are some instances where if you want to make parts of your ORCID record private, you can certainly do that as well. So it's really up to you, since as a researcher and researchers have full control of that data. All right. And finally, one thing that we really want to mention on the next slide is that you should be using your ORCID ID and encourage all of your researchers to use their ORCID ID wherever possible. So one of the indicator that say a system may have an ORCID functionality built into it or already have an ORCID integration is that green ID, ORCID ID icon that you'll see here in the middle. So that's one of the indicators that there's some sort of ORCID integration within that system. So if you do see that, we always encourage you to make the connection with that organization. You can make them a trusted organization, for example. So that way you can make your data available to them as well as the other organizations that are using ORCID or that are able to get updates or information from your ORCID record. And you can also get ORCID entries or ORCID information if they start pushing information to your ORCID record, for example. So if you do see that green ID icon, we always encourage you to make connections so that way the entire ecosystem works properly and also kind of makes it easier for everyone to be able to share and share information with one another and to have that data to be able to be interoperable with the different systems. And that kind of what the that question earlier about basically where sometimes it's difficult to maintain multiple platforms or multiple systems with the same information. So when you say, for example, you have an ORCID ID or an ORCID record, you'll be able to pass down that data to a ORCID integrated system, for example. Like faculty success, they're able to grab data from ORCID. To be able to populate the publications portion of your faculty reporting system, for example. So really, we encourage you to be using an ORCID ID or you use your ORCID ID and make the connections when you do see that ORCID ID icon. And finally, we just want to point out that on the last slide here, that there are resources available within this slide deck. When you do receive the recording, we will also share with you this slide deck. So that way you'll have access to this. You'll be able to see the different kind of tips that's available here, as well as ways that you could make connections or populate your ORCID record. There are additional resources available here. So these are linked that's available that you could go to and get more information if you need them. So that's available here as well. All right. And I think we are going to stop here and answer some questions. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these questions. All right, so I know that there were ones that came in earlier. Let's take a look. Um, so one of the things I kind of briefly talk about is that you will have faculty often say that they don't have to create a new profile and they feel overwhelmed, right? Because they have so many profiles to maintain or so many platforms to maintain. And it's really good if you do, to be using ORCID, your ORCID ID and your ORCID record to make sure that you're populating it and maintaining it. So that way you can use that data in your ORCID record to say, populate a funding application, for example, or you could use it to populate works in the faculty success. And there was also a question earlier about Science CV, right? So if you do have that ORCID record available, you can make the connection with Science CV as well. Science CV has an ORCID integration that's available, and you can make that connection. So when you make connections, you'll be able to grab data from your ORCID record to populate your bio sketches within Science CV. So that includes the education, the employment, as well as the works or the publications, for example. So those can get grabbed by Science CV, and then you can go ahead and create um, you can create your bio sketch out of that. And I also want to address the kind of a related question on that Science CV. Basically, one of the things about that, the last question is there a way to grant my admin assistant access to my record? And yes, in ORCID, you'll be able to assign a researcher or another person, essentially, on what we're calling a trusted individual in ORCID. So here you want to make sure that that other person has an ORCID record or an ORCID ID. So basically, you can make sure that your admin assistant has an ORCID ID, and then you can go ahead and add them as a trusted individual in your ORCID record. And on that slide deck that we are sharing with you all, I believe there's actually a portion down below on the researching on the additional resources that will show you how you can do this. And I will share my screen right now so you can see that. So adding a trusted individual to manage your ORCID record. So essentially, you would go to the trusted parties of your ORCID record, and just by clicking on the top right, and then you can go ahead and search for that person's name using an ORCID ID or the person's name, for example. And then you can go ahead and add that person as a trusted individual to your ORCID record. And here, for example, I've added my colleague Sheila Raven as a trusted individual. So you'll see that here. And then Sheila will be able to then add information to my ORCID record, make changes or updates if needed. All of that can be done in ORCID as well. All right, so let's take a look at other questions here.
Paolo, there
Yeah.
was not really a question, but a sort of discussion about faculty often feeling that they don't have time to create new profiles or feel overwhelmed by the use of different researcher profile sites. Do we have any maybe insight on this we want to share, ORCID related?
Yeah, so one of the things about that is that so they are, yeah, certainly there are a lot of platforms out there or other sites that need to be filled out. And we really hope that ORCID potentially could be able to just populate those things, right? So that's kind of one of the things that a big part of this ORCID as a way to kind of make connections with the different systems and different platforms. So that way you could just grab information from your ORCID profile to populate those kind of profiles in other systems. So other systems, like I've mentioned earlier about faculty success, you're able to do that. Symplectic elements, you're able to do that as well. Um, or if you're, say, creating a funding application via Proposal Central, you're able to do that as well. So this is really kind of what we hope a big part of ORCID is to be able to interoperate with the different kind of systems and different platforms. Of course, we are not there completely yet, right? In an ideal world, everything would just work the way it should be, but not every single platform or not everything is integrated with ORCID. So we do hope, but ultimately, and someday we hope that that could be the case. So that way to avoid that kind of getting overwhelmed with trying to fill out different forms or fill out different profiles. Um, in one of Kayla's example earlier, right, that you could like organizations are able to grab data from ORCID to populate a faculty profile, for example, or a faculty web page at the university. So those kind of things are really makes it easier, hopefully, for everyone down the road. Is there any other questions? I think I'm seeing a lot of questions, Kayla. Do we have any?
Yes, so another one that I saw was I wonder if it's preferable to link to only the official version of ORCID record for your publications or to use those versions available in an open repository. The latter almost always has to be entered manually, but to provide an unpaywall version of the work, but do funding agencies or publishers prefer to see the published versions?
Okay, so what I'm hearing, it sounded like, and let's say if you are, you have a version in your own institutional repository, and then there's a published version. Is that correct? That am I getting that right? And feel free to unmute as well if you want to clarify your question.
Hey, Paolo, it's Sheila.
Hi.
I've been putting some answers and some links to some of the questions. So just a heads up to everybody, if you did put a question in the chat, there may be like a link or something that helps to answer it. But for this particular question, um, at this stage, I'm not sure about the answer to whether funding agencies or any other stakeholders prefer a certain version over another. I think, um, any information that you can include is great. So I think at this stage, it's more about just being able to use ORCID as a way to streamline getting information about researchers' activities. So if only the published version is there, that's great. If only the open version in your repository is there, that's great. If both are there, that's even better. I put in my comment that if you do have, for example, kind of like duplicate entries, like different versions of the same work in your ORCID record, or maybe the same version but entered by different sources, like if you entered it yourself, but then it also was added from Crossref, if they have the same identifier, they will automatically be um, combined together, and you can see like the preferable source on top. But you can also combine different versions of the same work so that they kind of show up together in your ORCID record too. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Thank you, Sheila. All right. Any other questions? Anything that we missed, Kayla or Sheila? Anything that we want to highlight?
I'm scrolling through the chat now.
Yeah, this was a great discussion in the chat and lots of really good questions. There was one about, is it worth adding previous employment if you weren't publishing at that time? And along those same lines, I saw another one further down that was asking like, if I publish something before I had an ORCID ID, should I include that on my ORCID record? And to those questions, I would again say the more information you can include on your ORCID record, the better. I personally use mine as like, I don't really keep a Word doc resume or CV anymore. I just make sure my ORCID record is up to date, and I just always use that if I need to, you know, provide a resume or a CV. I put my ORCID ID in my email signature. If I'm ever giving a presentation and I'm asked for a bio, I always make sure that my ORCID ID is included there. Um, so so yeah, I would say any information that you want to include on your ORCID ID, yes, do include it. The more information, the better. And if there's certain things that you don't want to show up on your ORCID ID, you don't have to include those, or you can include those and just set the visibility, um, depending on how you want it.
Thank you, Sheila. There was actually a question that I just answered on the chat about, do you have to have an ORCID ID to use Science CV? So the short answer to that is that to use Science CV, you don't need an ORCID ID. However, if you want to use ORCID as a data source. For example, if you want to grab information from your ORCID record to populate your bio sketches, you will definitely need an ORCID ID and a populated ORCID record. And with that, so yes, short answer, you don't need it to use Science CV, but you will need it if you want information from your ORCID record to be added to your bio sketch in Science CV. All right. Any other questions?
I did see one kind of related to another one that hasn't been answered yet, so I'll just read it. Are some sources better for importing citations than others? I've found that imported records sometimes don't have the correct information in their correct fields, so I still have to manually edit them. Is Crossref better than Google, for example?
Really good question. And So one of the things really with ORCID is that ORCID does not create content or data. So basically, the metadata that you will see, a lot of the metadata you will see in ORCID are coming from other places, and they maintain those. And as far as the quality of the data, I believe it really just depends on where it's coming from. Um, some may have a much more complete information, others may not. So I don't know. I'm not at this time. I'm not really sure which one is better. Sheila, do you have any?
Sure.
In
I mean, it is really hard to say because there are so many different possible sources for metadata coming into ORCID. I would say that Crossref, DataCite, generally more reliable. Scopus, generally more reliable, just in terms of metadata completeness. Um, and all of those systems that are search and link wizards, they essentially already have their metadata fields mapped to ORCID. So at least you know the right metadata is going to the right places in the ORCID record, although sometimes there are issues with completeness here and there across the board. So it is kind of hard to say, which source is the best. For Google, if you have a Google Scholar profile, you can essentially export your like work citations from Google Scholar. It will export basically a BibTeX file, and then you can upload that to your ORCID record. And the metadata may be complete for that, but anytime you're uploading a BibTeX file, all of the metadata is going to go into the citation field, and that's just basically a free text field, and it's not structured metadata. So there are very kind of in the weeds considerations like that. But again, at this stage, the best thing you can do is just get information into your ORCID record as long as the information that's there is accurate. If there is some metadata missing, that's okay. But yes, we are trying to, push for having that metadata completeness for sure. And so that's just an ongoing effort across all of the stakeholders that are involved. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Sheila. All right, so let's see. What other questions do we have? And if you do have any other questions, we still have some time, so feel free to you can unmute if you like and ask your questions. You can continue asking via chat. If we can't get through all the questions today, we will do a follow-up with you or answer some of these questions also via email. So just don't hesitate. All right. Let's see. Any other questions? I think one of the things that I kind of briefly discussed earlier is I think we've talked a little bit about the peer review section as well earlier. So that peer review section will not appear um, in your ORCID record if there are no activities being pushed by an organization. So basically, if, say, a journal or a publisher have not pushed a peer review activity to your ORCID record, it will not show up. So that section of ORCID record, or peer review section, will not show up in your ORCID record. I've mainly seen the peer review section show up, let's say, for example, when I believe Web of Science has pushed it. So that shows up in the ORCID record. So those are kind of some examples out there as well.
There were a few other questions that I remember seeing in the chat that I just want to bring up quickly, just to make sure everyone knows that these questions were addressed. The first one, some people do have the letter X as part of their ORCID ID. And there was a question about that specifically. It doesn't really mean anything. I linked a reply to that question with an article from ORCID that describes why some ORCID IDs have an X. And basically it just represents the value of 10. So it's just a way to essentially expand the number of ORCID IDs, unique ORCID IDs that can be issued, so that, they're all different. The one thing I want to point out about that is if you do have the letter X in your ORCID ID, the X must be capitalized in order for that ORCID ID to be validated. And typically, you don't have to worry much about that, but if you do have that X in your ORCID ID, make sure if you're ever like typing your ORCID ID or displaying it anywhere that the X is capitalized. There was another question that I feel like I remember seeing where someone was asking what journals are using ORCID during their peer review process. There are so many questions, I'm having a hard time finding it, but I feel like I saw that.
Right.
I don't think we necessarily have a list of journals or anything like that, but I will say that most of the kind of big name scholarly peer-reviewed journals are using ORCID in their workflows. And if you are a peer reviewer for any journal and you receive an email or some sort of correspondence where they're asking you for your ORCID ID, the reason they're asking that is so that they can add that peer review service to your ORCID record. So don't ignore those emails if you have received those as a peer reviewer. It is kind of hard to keep track of all of the where and how ORCID is being used across the entire research and scholarly communication ecosystem. But if you have a question about a specific journal or publisher, we can probably more easily answer that. But right now we don't have that I know of. I don't think I've seen like a full list of all the publishers that are actively using the peer review functionality. I will also say that if you're at an organization that that is publishing your own open access journals, like if you're using OJS, OJS has a really great ORCID plugin that will collect ORCID IDs for the authors, write those publications to the author's ORCID record, and can also do ORCID IDs for peer reviewers and write peer review activity to ORCID. So if your organization is using OJS or if you're publishing through a journal that uses open journal systems, you may have the ability to leverage ORCID there. Which journals push to ORCID? I will say for that question, most of those like big name scholarly journals don't push publications to ORCID directly. They essentially assign DOIs to the publications through Crossref, and then Crossref pushes those publications to the author's ORCID records, as long as those authors' ORCID IDs were included in the Crossref DOI publication metadata. So hopefully that helps. There was a list at one point of publishers that had essentially signed some sort of letter saying that they were committing to using ORCID in their workflows. So I can see if we can find that and put that link in the chat.
Thank you, Sheila. Holly, do you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Is it okay for us to use that orcidus@lyrasis.org email if we were to have questions moving forward?
Absolutely. So if you
Okay.
do have any questions, if you want follow-ups, that sort of thing, please feel free to email us at orcidus@lyrasis.org. So this is what will essentially reach Kayla, myself, and Sheila. So hopefully one of us will be able to answer your questions. If there are things that we can't answer, we usually reach out to ORCID support to get more clarification and additional information to share with you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course. All right, we still have a few minutes. If you have any other questions, if we miss your questions today, we will follow up with you, make sure that we can provide you with information, or you can reach out to us at orchidus@lyrasis.org if you want if you have additional questions or things that you would like to know more about, please feel free to email us. All right, all right, any other questions? Okay. Okay,
There,
so
sorry,
go ahead.
Paulo, there was a new one that just came in. I know we only have 3 minutes, so if anyone wants to stick around. This was a question specifically about Crossref. And for example, someone is wanting their publications to appear in their ORCID record with the source as Crossref. Um, and so how to do that. So first I recommended using Crossref metadata search, which is the search and link wizard that's in ORCID. But the person pointed out that when you use the Crossref search and link wizard, the source is actually your name via Crossref metadata search. And that's because you actively went into the Crossref database and claimed those publications. So that's a really good point and a good follow-up question. Basically, if you want the source of your publication to appear as just Crossref, not your name via Crossref metadata search, the way to enable that is to, when you're submitting your publication, your manuscript to your publisher, make sure you include your ORCID ID in that submission and grant permission for that publisher to use your ORCID ID. When you do that, the publisher will include your ORCID ID in the DOI for that publication, and then Crossref will basically automatically add that publication to your ORCID record for you. So you can really only do that with publications that you submit like from now on. You can't really do that for past publications. The way to get past publications on your ORCID record is to use the search and link wizard. But for any future publications, just make sure you're including your ORCID ID in the submission, and you may get like a notification in your ORCID inbox, which is Crossref asking you for permission to make changes to your ORCID record. You're going to want to accept that and give that permission so that Crossref can add your publication to your ORCID record for you directly. But I'll also say that if some of your publications were entered manually by you or through the search and link wizard, that is also great. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have entered your own information. It's just that if it's entered directly from Crossref or directly from another trusted organization, it just lends a little bit more credibility. But just because you've entered it yourself or claimed it through a search and link wizard doesn't mean that the information is not credible. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you for that, Sheila. I'm
Yeah.
actually sharing my screen right now, so you can kind of see the differences between those three ways. So you're the first one here, you'll see that this is through a search and link wizard. So that's why you have that via a Crossref metadata search. The second one is a manual entry, so it's just my name. And the third one is that's the one with the green check mark, and that one is through Crossref directly. And that's the process that Sheila was talking about. All right, so we are now at the top of the hour. If you have any other questions, we can stick around for a little bit if you like. If not, feel free to email us at orchidus@lyrasis.org. Um, Continue asking questions, and we can provide that information to you. We will also send you all the recording as well as other additional notes from this session today. So just watch out for that in your email. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today.